Welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast, where frontline sales leaders teach you how to build and scale an outbound sales team.
This episode of the Predictable Revenue Podcast is brought to you by SDR Pods. Learn how we can build you a fully equipped sales development team to execute on personalized multi-channel prospecting and book you more meetings at the link below.
As a salesperson, you're a representative of your company, especially when we're talking about outbound, where you might be that prospect's first introduction to your company. They may never have heard of your company before. So that first impression that you make and then everything that you continue to do throughout that sales process is very, very important. And according to today's guest, a lot of salespeople are actually getting this wrong. I'm your host, Sarah Hicks. And today on the Predictable Revenue Podcast, I'm going to be chatting to an expert about the sales experience, how to keep your sales teams from killing your brand and your bottom line. He's been leading sales and marketing teams to success for over 20 years through his proven and predictable value selling framework. He has worked in sales, built teams, and achieved targets both within organizations and as a consultant, and was named a top 5 emerging training leader. He cuts through the outdated theory-based fluff so often attributed to sales training and gets down to the nitty-gritty with a raw, no BS perspective to look at what's working, what's not working, and where there might be opportunities to drive predictable revenue growth through sales optimization. Chad Sanderson, welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So give the audience a little background on who you are and what you do.
Well, let's see. Like most people, I probably ended up in the sales profession through a very circuitous route. My undergraduate degree was in English with a writing emphasis. I did marketing for 9 years and then switched over to sales. Was an individual contributor, ran teams, that kind of stuff, and was lucky very early in my career to be trained in the value selling framework. I hate to date myself, but we're going back 18 years, I guess. And it kind of changed the game for me in the way that I thought about how to interact with customers, how I prospected. And so about 4 years ago, decided that it was time to do this for a living since I'd seen the results that it could provide. So I went from being an executive to running my own P&L franchise of the Value Selling Associates and haven't looked back. So now I work with organizations of all sizes. We work with companies, very many brands that everybody would know, to help their teams make sure when they engage with prospects, they're doing it in a way that will resonate with the prospect to ideally create a frictionless sales experience.
Awesome. So talk to me about the idea that the kind of current popular sales process is self-serving.
Yeah. So a lot of things that are out there have a tendency to be designed from the sales process towards the buyer, rather than really taking into account what it is to engage a buyer in a very authentic way, focused on what they find valuable, and build your approach and process back into the business. There's definitely a need for methodologies that will help the business create predictable revenue, be able to forecast accurately, do everything that you need to do from a business, insight perspective. But the challenge is, if I'm building it from a self-serving standpoint or perspective, then the behaviors that I am incenting, the behaviors that I'm creating, the behaviors that I'm training my people on will oftentimes rub people the wrong way. I mean, it just has a tendency to be more about me than them. And we want to make sure, especially as buyer personas change, as their desires change, as everybody gets even now more used to being in a virtual world where you get things how you want it, when you want it, where you want it. We really need to make sure that what we're doing and how we're training our teams helps them be more authentic, helps them be more focused on and uncovering what someone else finds valuable.
Right. And you've seen kind of a key difference between the way B2B companies seem to tackle this versus B2C companies, right? And why is that? What's the difference there?
Well, in B2C, it's interesting. It's oftentimes much more experiential. I mean, everybody probably has, Netflix or Disney Plus, or everybody's probably using Amazon these days. And those digital interfaces, those representations of those brands, those have been very carefully crafted. They've been very carefully crafted to give, in that consumer environment, give the people what they want, when they want it, and how they want it. It's tailored to them. It learns in some cases. It's been designed to represent the brand in a way that removes the human element. But in B2B, it is still very much a people buy from people environment. And as a result of that, everybody lives a B2C life, and you're noticing those expectations change as they become and move into those B2B buying roles. They don't want to be sold to. They don't want to be pitched. They want to be worked with. They want to be heard. They want to be understood. They want somebody to take them on a buying journey, understand the buying vision. That's a different skill set than a much more transactional type of B2C environment, and one that requires almost an up leveling of the human element on the B2B side, which we don't really train our people to do very well or very often.
Right. So we should be selling, when selling to a B2B customer, we're selling to them as an individual first and foremost, then title, then company, rather than the kind of traditional B2B way, which is like potential customer is how we're selling to them.
Yes, absolutely. We sell to individuals. We do not sell to companies. And sales, that word, it's such a misnomer. Really, what we need to be doing is uncovering the problems that our prospects or customers have and helping them solve them. And if we're doing that, it's much more naturally consultative, naturally collaborative. It allows us to engage in a win-win situation almost by default. But if we prospect and we lead with, hey, look at us, look at this cool stuff we do, nobody likes that person at the party. So they're definitely not going to like you in a sales environment. If all you're doing is talking about yourself, people, we need to train our team to ask good questions, to have done the preparation, to be prepared to engage in a way that's going to be valuable or seen as credible from a prospect or customer's perspective. It's a subtle switch, and people talk a good game about it. There's a lot of the sales processes out there will tell you that, oh, this is all about the buyer back, but it's not about what steps do I have to take. It's how do I actually have a conversation? How do I connect to another human being? How do I uncover what they find valuable and then connect what I can uniquely bring to the table to those problems to help them solve them?
Okay, well, let's dig into that then a little bit more. So if we're to start these sales process from scratch, from that really, really buyer prospect centric perspective, what's your first move? How do you build out that sales process from the ground up, really coming from that buyer perspective?
Yep. And so if you think about the revenue funnel, regardless of what the stages of the process are, you have to find people, you have to identify them, you have to engage them, you have to qualify them, then you have to educate them, close them, and then of course, depending on the type of business, implement, potentially upsell, rinse and repeat, right? So it all starts in that finding category. So a lot of people will rely on marketing, and I know sales reps love it when marketing provides them leads, and then there's a conversation about how quality they are or are not. But at the end of the day, it's really about identifying what is our ideal customer profile. What are the types of the companies, and more importantly, the types of roles that we want to work with that we can help. We can do research and personalization at scale based off of a role in an industry, which allows us to do it faster and in a way that resonates more effectively with individuals, rather than spending all the time to go so deep into an individual. Hey, I'm crafting a special message for Sarah. Well, that's not scalable. It doesn't work at that level. And when you don't already know somebody, all of the research shows that people identify with their role first. So if we're really if we have an ICP, if we have a client profile and we understand the roles that we're going after, then it's about the preparation. What do they care about? What challenges are they facing? How do I engage them in a conversation that shows them I know them, that shows them that I have something of value that may be able to help them solve some problems? And then making sure that our teams, when they prospect, are prospecting with that person's perspective in mind. When I'm selling, how do I uncover that evolving vision of what the optimal solution is? How do I put together a plan with them to get them not to close or not to implementation, but to a point in the future where they realize the value that convinced them to buy, so that they've accomplished their goals, and we stay focused on that. A lot of organizations have a tendency to measure people and focus on, hey, have you made this many dials? Have you made set this many meetings? What does your pipeline look like? And those are all important metrics, but it's all about the initial look, the initial approach that we have when we're doing those things. And if all we're doing is incenting or structuring or training our team to understand our process and our metrics and what we need to do, then at the end of the day, we're not giving them the right behaviors and enabling them in the right way.
Okay, got it. So what do you think is the best way to really dig in deep and flesh out all of these potential goals and challenges that specific title might have? Where would one go find that information? How would you compile it? How do you do that research?
Great question. So a lot of people, we'll ask clients when we're working with their teams, how much time do your team spend on research? Or we'll ask the individuals how much time, and we'll get answers from, I spend an hour a week to 5 hours a week to 80 hours a week in some cases when they're really over the top. But really, it only takes 15 to 20 minutes to do the research necessary to start the customization process. And you're basically going to hit two things. You're going to go look for credible third-party resources that are going to tell you this is what that role in that industry is facing, right? If I'm a CMO in retail, maybe I'm facing challenges related to moving foot traffic in store to a digital experience. And there'll be some goals around that. Well, if that's what they're primarily focused on, thinking through what are the people, process, and technology challenges keeping that from happening is a fairly simple mental process. We then capture what we call a prospecting prompter that allows us to provide a very quick, promptable resource to a team member, CSD, or to a salesperson, so that they can have a conversation and ask questions, be prepared to ask those questions. So it demonstrates through the types of questions they're asking that they have done their research, that they do understand what that person might be facing, and they're prepared to demonstrate with value stories, hey, we provided this type of capability to this company with this outcome, and it helped them solve that very problem that you're having. What has a tendency to happen is if we don't provide them very simple prompters, and I'm not talking scripts, I'm not a fan of scripts. We want everybody to be authentic. If we don't provide them with that prompter, then their cognitive load is split between I have to deliver a conversation in confidence, I have to make sure I know what I'm saying, then I have to make stuff up, now I have to handle objections, and then they're all over the place. And that gets in the way of that human connection because they're more concerned at that point about what they're doing rather than what they're hearing.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree with you more there. I think that's such a big challenge. Even for those reps that are doing the research, they do the research for like that first email. And then when it comes time to have the first phone call, they have not got a clue. Like they're stuck, right. They're floundering. So I totally agree. It's super vital that that this is documented in some kind of like easily digestible way so that they can keep referring back to it throughout that entire process. And again, that goes back to your initial point and kind of the purpose of this whole podcast, that it's not a good look for your company if your salesperson is kind of floundering on the other end of the line and not able to kind of have any kind of back and forth, not able to provide good examples of why they should work with you, provide examples of like similar customers, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that's a really, really important point to note.
Well, it's interesting too, if you think about it, we all love to talk about ourselves, but now we're in a situation where in a B2B environment, I have to genuinely be curious about not only the individual that I'm talking to, but their business, their environment, what's going on with them. We want people to connect, but at the end of the day, if I don't train a representative to have effective conversations, then their impression, that individual's impression of my company could potentially be negatively impacted. And it also could impact that person's career because at the end of the day, they're buying from that individual, not the brand. So there's a significant amount of risk and blowback potential if it's not handled in a way that is authentic, genuine, focused, and well prepared. A lot of people just like to, what's the old phrase? Show up and throw up. Like, hey, I'm just going to wing it. And you can't do that. It's gotten even more important to do the prep to make sure you understand exactly who you're talking to in a way that's going to be valuable to them.
Yeah, that's right. It's Chris Voss who says or it's something in psychology says you revert back to your most basic level of preparedness.
Yes.
And it's not going to be knowing everything about that customer unless you've done a bunch of research.
Yeah. Well, and it's like Voss, I think Voss said it. And then it's also true for, SEAL teams. The reason they all practice so much is that in a crisis, you will revert back to what you are most trained or most aware of. And unfortunately, due to the society and things that we live in, that's a very me centric approach. So you get a question or an objection and you're not sure how to handle it, all the training goes out the window unless you've done the research, unless you've given them a framework that will allow them to respond at a level that will enhance your brand experience, not hopefully revert back to that, hey, let's talk more about me.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the very first touch. I know obviously continuing throughout the rest of those touch points are equally as important, but let's say this is a cold outbound situation. So it's that very first impression that the sales rep is making on the prospect. What should a first touch point look like for you? Is there a particular script or template that you like to use to kind of tie in that sort of personalization at scale that you've developed from that title?
Yeah. So what I prefer to do is give people constructs. So a framework or a construct, I don't want to give them their words, right? If I give them the right framework and construct, then they're going to sound like themselves, but across the organization, you're going to get to consistent behavior. In that very first outreach, if I've done my homework, if I've done my 15 to 20 minutes worth of research, I understand from an industry trend standpoint what it is that that person may be facing. I also understand what we have from a marketing standpoint where I can demonstrate we've actually solved that problem. I have this sitting in front of me in what we call a prospecting prompter. And then what I'm able to do is in my first outreach, provide them something of value to them based on that perspective and build on that as I go through, slowly moving them into this is why we need to have a conversation. The first touch, my belief is the first touch should 100% be about providing value to them from their perspective, and ideally will not have anything to do with my company. It will simply show them that I, as a professional, have done some research, understand what they're up against. They might find this valuable. They may have already seen it, but I want to pull this out. And that it could be a Gartner report, a Forrester report, an industry trend report. It could be a podcast that they've listened to and say, hey, you know what? Other individuals like you that I work with found this really valuable. Here's a link to this podcast. And better yet, you may not listen to the whole thing, but this quote right here, I think this is something that you might want to consider in the role that you're in. Would love to know your thoughts. Then as I build on that, I want to pull out and I'm going to highlight some of those problems that they probably are facing so that it's like, hey, we know you probably are facing this. If you haven't solved it, let's have a conversation. If you have, would love to know how you did, right? So that I can continually educate myself. And so it becomes what we call we're priming the memory as we go through that prospecting cadence. We're basically showing them that we know them, that we are focused on really trying to help them solve problems. And we're not pitching them and sending them a whole bunch of stuff they didn't ask for about a company they may not know a lot about. That seems a little desperate and can negatively impact the brand as well.
So it's like you're working them through a funnel, kind of even just with an outbound cadence where it starts off really wide, general to their types of problems. And then you kind of figure out if they have certain problems, and then eventually once you're sure they've got that problem, that's when you can position yourself as a potential solution to that problem.
Absolutely. We know that it takes somewhere between 15 to 17 touches across 22 to 24 business days on average to convert to a conversation. One of the other things we have to do is train our people to understand that prospecting is not about setting meetings. Prospecting is about getting information. Are they facing problems we can help them solve? And if not, what are they worried about? So that we then start to have some contextual understanding of when they may be in a buying window or be in an area where they have problems. Am I talking to the right person? Am I prospecting into a place where, you know what, they just signed a contract with a competitor and it runs out in 12 months. Well, great. I need to know that because I don't want to spend more time prospecting into them when I could be focused on other areas as I go through it. So that awareness and understanding that information becomes absolutely critical. Doing it in a way that at every touch point shows that prospect that you understand them, that you understand what they're dealing with, helps build a trust in the brand without ever having to us talk about ourselves.
So imagine this is a kind of organization that has that SDR AE split. They've done a really great job. That SDR are bringing this prospect through the funnel. They've agreed to that next meeting with the AE. What does a good AE handoff look like in a real buyer centric?
Yep. That is one of the friction points internally that we often see. So ideally what you want is the prospect, you want your CSD to be able to say, hey, this prospect told me they have this problem. I haven't gotten a time-bound quantifiable element, but they told me they have this problem. They're trying to achieve this goal. I shared with them this story and I've asked them these couple of questions. Here's the information. Here's some other stories that I believe would resonate with them based on this prospecting prompter that we create. And now if the AE has been trained in the value selling framework, they convert that into a conversation with an individual. When we prospect, we're prospecting to a role in an industry. When that handoff happens, we have to provide enough information that now the AE can go to a level to continue the conversation without making them repeat themselves so that they can sell to the individual. So So ideally, you should be able to do an SDR or BDR handoff to an AE in about 10, 15 minutes. And we see companies where they're spending 50 minutes, 60 minutes on these handoffs when it doesn't need to be that, because then all you're doing is confusing. Chances are AE is not going to remember half the information anyway. Then they're going to start asking questions that makes the prospect repeat themselves, and nobody likes that. So that concise, using a framework, prospecting prompter, in our parlance, prospecting prompter to a value prompter, allows that conversation and that buying experience to be consistent and to grow organically, so that it feels like a natural evolution of the relationship. And what we see is, as a result, we see significant increases in deal sizes, increases in sales velocity, so that deals close faster. We see a huge increase in forecast accuracy, because I know exactly what I have, what I don't, what I need to get, right? And as a result, those metrics that are put off allow the business to do what it needs to do without compromising that relationship of creating a frictionless buying experience all the way through.
Right. Absolutely. That totally makes sense. The conversation that happens between the SDR and the AE, where they're sharing all this information they've gathered about the prospect, do you think that's something that can happen, just by leaving notes in an opportunity in a CRM, or do you think that's an on the line or in-person conversation that should be had between those two?
Yeah, I love that question. So ideally, rainbows, unicorns, and puppies, right? You would be able to do it inside of a framework. I could be able to look at the notes in a system. I would know exactly what I need to know to continue the conversation. Organizations have a tendency to not necessarily implement CRMs in a way that make people overly fond of using them. So there is oftentimes gaps in the data. So if we're talking rainbows and unicorns, yes, I think it could be done that way. And that's typically what we strive to help them move towards. But if there needs to be a quick question or two answered, it can be done in 10, 15 minutes. It doesn't need to be taking an entire hour to transition one account. So I think there's a kind of a middle ground, a combination between the two. If everybody has the same understanding of the framework, the same language, if that is implemented into the CRM correctly and the right behaviors are incented for it to be completed, then it should be very quick handoff and continued evolution in the system, as well as with the relationship between the BDR, the AE, and the prospect.
Okay. And what do you think is the best way for that BDR to introduce the prospect to the idea that they're now going to have that conversation with somebody other than themselves?
They need to be right up front. They need to be right up front. I'm a big believer in being 100% candid, and transparent. So I say at the beginning when I'm prospecting, because I still do 50, do my call blocks every day. I've got a 100% commission sales rep as a business owner. I'm right up front and say, hey, I'm going to, just so you know, as we're having this conversation, it sounds like this is going to continue. I just want you to know I'm going to bring in somebody else that's going to be able to answer more questions and paint a much more complete picture as we go through it. So being upfront with what that process is and not waiting till like the end of the second call, be like, oh, okay, I have to hand you off now. That creates a friction. It creates a friction point. So being very clear, over communicating, which is definitely required in a completely digital environment. Just in general, I think over communication is better. Don't let them guess what's going to happen next. Don't let them assume. Be very crystal clear and present it in a way that, hey, we've designed this to make this all about you and it's for your benefit. We've seen it be very effective, but you also don't have to overplay it. Just like, hey, this is the way we do business. But being upfront is key.
Okay, great. And you mentioned a couple of times in this conversation the idea of incentive and how we have before been training our SDRs and giving them incentives to kind of behave in this potentially not attractive way to a buyer. Do you think that the kind of comp plans and the incentives that we give our SDRs are attributing to this bad behavior?
I think in some ways it does, yes, but I also understand the business perspective of, hey, we need some metrics, right? So for example, we'll often see comp plans where people are, BDs are incented on number of meetings set, rather than maybe a metric around talk time. Let's have a metric of how many calls and how long those calls need to be. I need to hit an average amount of talk time. That then incents me to have a conversation, do what I need to do to be better at having that conversation, to prolong it, to make it convert. So instead of looking at just setting a meeting, because anybody can set a meeting, let's look at kind of quality metrics for that. Let's look at metrics around conversion. Like how many of my handoffs convert to a sales accepted S1, whatever you want to call it, lead where sales is actually going to start to work it. Now I need to have that wrapped in a bow, so to speak, for the handoff. that's a little bit better than, hey, we're going to comp you on the number of activities you have, or here's the number of dials you need to do, or here's the number of meetings you need to set. Those are important things to look at. But when we look at those numbers, I can tell you based on how many dials somebody makes, how many connections they have to a real human being, and then the percentage to conversion, I can tell you whether they're just not dialing enough, or they're connecting people, but they need help with objection handling, or the further conversion of their talk time so low, their handoffs don't convert. There are other ways, I think, to structure it in a balance. So the business gets what it needs, but we're also incenting those behaviors that we know are going to generate more consistent engagement with a prospect.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Okay, so for the sales leaders that are listening to this right now, who this has just resonated with them, they're like, oh, I'm in total agreement. We've been doing this all wrong. And now they're looking to take that first step to implement and kind of change their sales cycle from this salesperson serving sales cycle to a prospect or customer serving one. Where do you start? What's the first step to changing this up?
So the one thing we want to do, so I would say we're not a technology company, right? We have some technological solutions, but we're a behavioral change company. The first thing we do is I want to talk to some of the leaders. I want to understand what is it they're trying to accomplish? What is the metrics they've got out there? I want to take a look at the way the sales process is structured, because we don't want to rip and replace anything. We want to amplify existing investments in process and tech. So in order to do that, we have to do a level of assessment of what's the tech stack look like? What do the stages look like? We want to talk to the managers, because in any change initiative, 80% of the success rests on the shoulders of the frontline managers. So we need to know that they're bought in. We need to know what their challenges are. And then we start to craft an approach, an educational approach that will allow us, because all of our stuff is very modular, to customize the approach specifically for the customer, to step them through. Once we have that assessment, we look at how's the organization structured? Are we in a hierarchical organization, or are we running pods? Are we running trains? What is the relationship between sales and marketing? Then we want to look at the process. We want to understand how all of this works together. What's the glue? And then we want to look at the behaviors that are currently taking place and identify the gaps between the two. From that type of assessment, we're able to put together a very clear, here's a recommended approach, not only to get a framework put in, not only to get your team doing the right behaviors, but also to do it in a way that's going to reduce the risk associated with change that happens in any organization. So it's very much an assessment-based approach at first. We have some surveys, and it's a lot of conversational data collection and analysis, but it allows us to get a complete picture and an unbiased picture, because a lot of times we'll get, well, this is how my team does it. This is how the field does it. Not usually. In fact, I would say 9 times out of 10, when a CRO, chief growth officer, or something says, this is how it happens in the field, when we start to have conversations, that's not how it's actually happening in the field at all. So a big part of it too is also getting everybody on the same page. And that becomes the kind of the first step for us creating that common language, that common approach, that evolution to a buyer-centric type of sales experience and sales process.
That makes sense. And in a lot of sales teams where maybe the management brings in new ideas or new processes, there can be a struggle for there to be adoption across that whole team. It's tough. You mentioned you don't want to do a rip and replace, because that's tough. People are never going to just absolutely leave behind everything that they've ever done and do something new. But if you are asking them to do some amount of new things in their sales process, how can you effectively track that adoption is happening if you're not able to, sit with every single person and see what they're doing all day?
Yeah. So we work with, part of our process is also, once we get into the educational portion of it, we work with the managers to help them build out 30, 60, 90-day plans, which we teach them how to refresh every 90 days. Part of that is identifying not only leading indicators, behavioral indicators, like we're seeing more of these types of follow-ups, or we're seeing an increase in this activity, or we're seeing an increase in the number of assets created. Whatever those leading behavioral metrics may be, these are the things we're looking for over the first 30 to 45 days. We work with the managers to put in place an approach that will allow them to incent that, as well as measure it, whether it be maybe their CRM is set up in such a way we can run a report, or maybe it's the way they're doing deal reviews, or something like that, something they're doing on a regular basis. Then we're also working with them to identify what are the lagging indicators. When that behavior has started to stick, what are the things I should start to see? What are the measurable results that I should start to see? We build that into the 30, 60, 90-day plans, and also then help them create a coaching plan underneath that so that they can drive the adoption. The beautiful thing of the approach that we use is that the light bulbs go on for the vast majority of people in the workshops, in the virtual, even in the in-person workshops. And we're doing real work. So they come out of the workshop with something they can apply the very next day. And the minute they see the change that happens, they're bought in. And so we just need to keep that energy going, because at some point they're going to realize, hey, this is a new shiny object and it's cool, but it's still work, which usually happens at about the 30 or 45 day mark. So we want to make sure we're building out those plans to drive those adoptions, measure it, and report back up in a quantitative and qualitative way to the organization.
Great. And what about kind of building a team from scratch? If I'm, maybe the first sales hire at an organization, and this structure that you've laid out for me is really appealing, how should I go about finding the right people to bring onto my team to work within this type of framework?
Yeah, that's about behavioral interviewing. So we want to make sure we're looking for people that are coachable, people that are not coming in with a perspective that this is the only way I know how to do it. It's been successful for me. We need somebody that's going to understand that what any organization has to do is create scale, the ability to scale. And the only thing that creates that is consistency of behavior. And so they need to know that part of the interviewing process needs to include that candid conversation. And part of it needs to be, hey, we have a framework and an approach that we're using, and tell them about it. And if you don't think you can do this, this may not be the right fit for you. A lot of small organizations will try and go get a lone wolf or two or three, and each person's doing, and that may work for a startup company when we just need to get revenue in right away. But when you start to get into being SMB, or even better yet, wanting to go public, you have to have consistency. There has to be some framework. So your managers are coaching consistently, assessing deals consistently, that your BDRs are reaching out in a way that supports the brand, leverages the marketing investments that you've made, that it allows you to see the progression all the way through. And consistency of behavior is the key. And in order to do that, you have to have the framework. So again, be upfront with them, see if there's a type of person who can be coachable, who's willing to learn something new. What I find most interesting is the people that have just come out of college that we work with are very easy for them to adopt because they're looking for anything. And then the ones that have been doing it 20 to 25 years go, wow, I forgot all the things I should have been doing. And this is great because it's super simple. It's just going to make me better. And the ones in the middle are the ones that go, I'm not 100% sure how to reconcile this with other training I may have had. And so we spend a lot of time getting them through a discovery process in the workshops where they buy in themselves. We're not preaching or telling them what to do. We're giving them opportunities to see just how well it can work. And once they see the personal value, they pick it up and run with it.
Makes sense. And I think that's one of the great things about this being kind of a framework, as you've mentioned, where it's not a script, it's not an exact template, it's not a roadmap that people have to follow, but it's a framework within which they can authentically be themselves, but in this kind of repeatable, scalable way. And most importantly, is transferable across all the different reps. I think that is such a difficult thing. And I think it really is kind of binary in the world that we see today, where you've either got all your reps literally sending out the exact same email or having the exact same phone calls, or they're completely running on their own and they're tasked with designing their sequences and writing their own copy and all of that stuff. So I think that's something that's so great about this, is that it's right in the middle, and it gives some guidance, but still allows reps to be themselves and use their own initiative.
Yeah, it is basically designed to prompt them to not forget something. We've all had that meeting. It doesn't matter what part of the organization you're in. We've all had that meeting where we come out of it and at first we're like, wow, that was great. It was awesome. Felt connected. And then you get a couple steps away and you go, forgot to ask that one question. And without that answer, I can't move on. This framework keeps that from happening, allows us to be authentic. It becomes a conversational GPS so that we stay focused on what we need to do to uncover another person's perspective. If technology were going to solve the B2B sales problem, it would have done it by now. What we have is a human problem. And if we don't attack it and work on that side of it, then you're going to consistently churn through, we're going to try this year, try this next year, try that. And you're not going to have an organization that can bring people in and deliver a consistent buying experience that supports the brand, supports the organizational goals.
Yeah, we had somebody, I think it was maybe on the podcast or maybe just some thought leader this year, said something like, like salespeople, you're going to be replaced by AI in the next like however many years. And that at first is a terrifying thought. And then at second glance, that's not the case. It's not going to happen because people are sick of technology in that way now. We've kind of reverted now away from this technological buying process and now back to this really, it's almost parallel to that really like traditional relationship based in person, like wine and dine. It's much closer to that than what it's been in the kind of 10-year span in between now and when that stopped happening. So I think salespeople, do not fret. You're not going to be replaced by AI, but you do now have to focus that much more on the relationships, the human, the behavior, all of that stuff, which is something I think as a populace, we're kind of out of practice with. So it's important
without a doubt.
sharpen those tools again.
Absolutely. The beautiful thing about AI is that it gives us insights and information, but it will not replace that human-to-human connection. And now, since we've all been living virtual for almost a year at this point, the reluctance to rely or trust technology, of course, you could always look at the news and find the articles that, or Elon saying that, hey, it's going to take over the world. You can see all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, people crave that human experience. And we've all been so virtual. It's even more important. People are craving it even more, but they want it in a way that's genuine to them. And so I don't want to necessarily just sit around and listen to somebody tell me all about themselves. I want to have a conversation. And the art of having a conversation, a deliberate conversation where I am guiding them, challenging their thinking without creating friction, providing them a buying vision, getting them across a finish line to accomplish something they want, whether it's internal conversations between coworkers or it's conversations along the sales revenue funnel. It's just a skill that everybody's going to need. And it's something we haven't seen people train individuals in a way that will drive appreciable benefit for the business.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, Chad, it's been really wonderful having you on the show. We've touched on some really, really important subjects here. There's a ton of value for all those sales leaders and even sales practitioners that are listening to this episode right now. If people want to learn more from you or more about what you guys do, where can they get in touch with you?
So the easiest one for me is just shoot me an email. It's just chad.sanderson@valueselling.com. You can't miss me on LinkedIn. The bald head shows up. So just look for me on LinkedIn and you can hit me there. If you want more information on the approach, just valueselling.com. And don't hesitate to reach out. Heck, I'll even give you my phone number because I still, unlike some people, will answer the phone. It's 303-834-5932.
There you go, folks. You better do a really, really good cold call though, because you're
otherwise I'm going to call your CEO and convert them to, hey, I can fix that.
There you go. Well, thanks again, Chad, for coming on. Yeah, really, really great having you. Some really great subjects here. I can't wait until people hear this episode and can't wait to hear their feedback and what they've implemented. Thank you for coming on the show.